we're going to be looking at violence and non-violence and gender. Just to maybe start us off on a bit of I don't know, housekeeping perhaps. I know this is a very sensitive subject. It might bring up some upsetting issues. So if people don't want to talk, or you need to take a bit of time for yourself or take a break, please just feel free to do that and do what's best for you. Maybe if we just make extra care when we're discussing these topics. And I say that mainly because even when I was researching and writing tonight's topic, I was like, this is pretty hard going. So if people feel like they do just need a minute, then that's fine. We'll begin with a bit of an overview of the intersection of violence and gender. And then we'll look a bit at the role of religion and theology within this. And then we'll have a bit of time for discussion. And after that, we'll look at how can the church respond and what might some of those resources be. So looking at lessons from the Gospels and the role of women within non-violence. And then we'll also spend a bit of time today at the end of the session just discussing a little bit more generally our reflections on the book project and what we have got out of it, or what we might want to know a bit more about as well. But I thought maybe, seeing as we have a new Pope now, we could begin with a prayer for Pope Leo XIV. Would anyone like to lead us in prayer? Or I can, if...
I'm happy to read a prayer if it's up on the screen to read, yeah?
Yeah, right, I will read the screen. Thank you very much. Can you see that okay?
Oh, yes, can now, yeah. Will I just start?
Yes, please, yeah.
Prayer for Pope Leo XIV. Faithful God, you guide us on the path of life, and your goodness is our constant companion. Be with our new shepherd, Pope Leo XIV, in his service of the Church. Fill him with the power of your Spirit, the peace of your presence, and the compassion of Christ. May he walk with you in wisdom and humility, and lead us together with all God's people to embody your love for the world. Amen.
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 Thank you so much, Roslyn. So just to get us started, we'll just, as we usually do, just spend a few minutes thinking about if anyone wants to share, is there anything that struck you about non-violence or violence since our last meeting? Any new insights, reflections that you'd like to share?
I think the question of non-violence, as we're beginning to approach it, is the kind of missing thing in the church's teaching. Because you know how through the years it's been addressed either to kind of the clerical people or occasionally to rulers. But this is where theology meets lay life, which, you know, in some periods it seems like that was an afterthought. You know, the church is the clerics and the lay people do as they're told. The teaching of non-violence, as we're beginning to address it, is our bit. And that seems to me to be a big shift in the way the church develops. And I think that would be really exciting.
Thanks, Elizabeth. That's a really interesting reflection, actually, as I suppose that kind of, in some ways, the empowerment of that as well for the laity. Yeah, it's really interesting. Thank you. there anything else that anyone would like to share? Yeah, Marianne?
This is a little bit off-piste, as it were, but Anne and I on Saturday were part of a march, a march to end the war in Palestine, and we marched through Glasgow. And while we were going, you know, obviously there were chants and so on, and at the end there were speeches, and I just felt that this was asking for peace, and yet there was an anger and a violence in those chants and in the way that the speeches were delivered. In fact, the final one, Anne and I agreed that you know, what the content was perhaps you know, we could agree with the content, but the delivery of it was so, I found it actually kind of physically got to me, in that it was so loud and shouty. And I think that that's part of what's going on in society at the moment, is there is an inner anger within people. I don't know if you would agree with that, Anne.
I would definitely, and I was also going to say that I've been finding out a lot recently about anger and hostility, particularly. I mean, I've sort of told some of the Pax Christi people that my son's been doing some work into the effect of social media on young children, and he's been reading a book by a chap called Jonathan Haidt, who's an American psychologist, saying that no children under the age of, well, he would say 16, should be given social media devices, because they're being, not just they're searching for violent material, but they're being offered within half an hour of joining a social media platform. They're being offered really horrific, misogynistic content. You know, women being strangled, and you know, extreme pornography, and then I've also been finding out, which I didn't, because I don't do social media, but I've been finding out about some of the kind of misogyny, anger against women. There's this thing, incel group, you know, and the kind of anger against women, the idea that women in the last few decades have become much too dominant, and you know, there's a whole cadre of men who've faded into the background and aren't given their due notice and privilege and so on. So I'm finding out a lot of stuff that's extremely disturbing, really. But I would definitely agree with Marion. It was the speech, particularly the last speech on Saturday. It was just screaming, really, and I just found it, you know, well, disturbing, actually. So.
And did the audience, do you think, generally found it disturbing, or did people find that compelling? Or
I don't know. She may have been making some worthy points, really, but the way that it was delivered, I mean, she was clapped at the end. I don't know, really. You know, I don't know. I wouldn't like to try and see inside other people's minds, you know, but for me it was a complete turn off. I don't like that kind of aggression. So
yeah, I suppose there's a question there as well, isn't there, about being peaceful in a peaceful protest, or how do you go about doing those sorts of yeah, thanks for sharing that, both of you. So anything else that anyone wanted to share? Yeah, Marianne?
Sorry, it just occurred to me the feelings that I had when we were actually on the march and there were chants and so on. The thought went through my head as we were marching, and you can't help but sort of, you know, repeat the words kind of thing. You may not be shouting yourself, but you find yourself repeating the words. And I thought how easy it was for Nazis to, you know, you see those huge crowds of young people and older people all just responding to that, and it's far too easy. It's far too easy to kind of stir up that kind of response, I feel.
Yeah, and I suppose there's questions there as well, isn't there, of, I suppose, looking more towards the long term, is that creating more hostility in the long term or more kind of division, or but yeah, that's really interesting what you say as well, Marianne, of how easy it is to get sucked into that as well.
Yeah, don't you feel that that people who really feel peace, like ourselves, I think like that, we are in a minority. And when you get in a demonstration like you described, you are going to be in a minority. And the big problem is, do we ever affect change if we don't join in? And I think sometimes we just have to do that. I mean, I know it's terrible now, it's probably worse than ever, but it's always been that problem. I mean, on peaceful demonstration, there's always been an element you wish weren't there. I mean, I remember getting myself under a ban once where we were shouting, "Kill the boss kids," you know? I mean, what was that about? I mean, I don't want to kill anybody, but there's the common cause, and it's a difficult one. I think sometimes you just have to go along with it, not support it, but be there to increase the numbers.
Yeah, but is there not a problem with that you kind of compromise? There's too much compromise in that.
If a minority is so small, you just never get noticed, and that's my worry. I mean, we want peace. We don't want violence in any form whatsoever. But I feel we're a long way from getting that. I mean, maybe this Pope, following the last Pope, will make a difference. There's a lot of Catholics in the world, but look at the Catholic community. I sometimes wish that the Catholic Church under Pope Francis, under Pope Leo, would be more authoritarian and tell the Church what to do, because then perhaps with people like Rees-Mogg and Leon Fox and all the other Catholics that we know are there, what would they do? Perhaps they'd leave. You know, perhaps Anne Widdecombe would leave. That'd be good. I just, you know, enough. There we are.
Grace, did you want to come in? I know you had your hand.
Well, I've probably got 3 points. One is talking about getting involved in a demonstration where there are things being chanted you don't like. This has been going on for years. I remember being one at the very beginning of my involvement with Justice and Peace, and there was a young girl at the front who was shouting, you know, fairly rude slogans about the Tories. And I always remember one of Motherwell Justice and Peace Commission, as we all arrived at where we were finishing, turning to and saying, "That is not acceptable. Stop doing that." And the girl looked slightly stunned that she was being criticised. How long it would stop her doing it, I don't know, but at least there was an opportunity to say to her, not everyone agrees with what you're saying. That's not the way to deal with it. On the issue of, you know, why are we hearing this, the real passion in some of the marches? I suppose if you're coming from a situation where you feel really passionate about what's been done to you or your people, it gets it out of your system. And if we can only find a way of getting things out of people's systems without it leading on to anything else, great. But unfortunately, we can't. But it's part of that. I mean, that's why I think Germany took off the way it did, is they had what they felt was a legitimate gripe about being done down after World War I. And Hitler linked into that. And the rest, as you say, is history. And it's happening everywhere. Unfortunately, I don't know, how do we stop this happening? How do we give people some means of expressing their legitimate anger? And we saw it, I can't remember who was with me, I think it may have been Anne-Marie at the first of the meetings for Ukraine in Glasgow's George Square. And it was okay at the beginning, but then they suddenly started, you know, free Ukraine, and it got very, very chanty. And we both looked and thought, I'm not comfortable with this. So I'm going now, because it was getting very much very militaristic. But you could see where it was starting from. We've had it with some of our colleagues in Justice and Peace Europe. The Ukrainian rep says it's all very well us saying to them, non-violence, but how do you say that to someone acceptably in a situation where he is facing, or his family are facing, the rockets every day? We have to find a way through that, but it's a difficult one. It's not going to be easy. And you do need to get a grip of some of our politicians. I'm sorry, I still hold some of the Tory politicians responsible for the death of Joe Cox, because without their language, that would not have happened. And nobody accepted responsibility for it, not one of them.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah, thanks, Grace. I think that also kind of, as you were speaking, I think that brings up some of the points that we've been talking about with non-violence, and that intersection with, it isn't just the violence, but it's that intersection with powerlessness and marginalisation, and how that creates those cycles, or perhaps sets conditions where those sorts of things happen as well.
and grief too.
But
Yeah.
it's interesting. I'm horribly old, and my mother and I went to Greenham Common, and that was actually a very peaceful. If you want a demo, then a bunch of women was actually they sang songs, they were kind to each other. Now maybe we were there on a good day or two, but I don't know, but I think that there was a different atmosphere from Grace and I have been on demos of different kinds for many decades, and I think that where it was all women was actually a very different kind of a feel to it. So I don't know if there is something to that in relation to what we've been reading in the book over the past few days.
Yeah, thanks, Maria. And I think that would be really nice to hear a bit more about that, as well as we're sort of discussing some of these things, that, especially when we're talking about gender and non-violent resistance. I think that leads us quite nicely into starting as well what we're looking at today. So last time we looked at the environment, and we were talking a bit how violence is an intersectional issue. Which also means that when we're looking at non-violence, we're addressing that intersection. And we also thought a little bit about the role of theology and religion in both perpetuating and solving environmental violence. And I think today, when we're looking at gender, we'll see that there's similar themes that are coming up here. I just want to start by giving a bit of context and a bit of background, just to talk about gender-based violence. And I think this will probably, or at least I found this probably the most hard-hitting bit of today's session. So the UN, they define gender-based violence as violence that's directed against a woman because she is a woman, or that affects women disproportionately. And that includes acts that inflict physical pain, mental or sexual harm or suffering, threats of such acts, coercion, or other deprivations of liberty. Discrimination against women and inequality in the distribution of power and resources between men and women are root causes of violence against women. And the UN says that violence against women and girls is one of the world's most prevalent human rights violations, taking place every day, many times over, all over the world. And that has physical, economic, social, psychological implications that stop the full and equal participation of women and girls in society. So when we're thinking about the types of violence, we know that there are certain things that exacerbate these types of violence, and we'll come back to this a bit later. But we know that when there are other crises, humanitarian, environmental, COVID, or conflict, violence against women becomes exacerbated in these crises as well. There are several different forms of types of violence against women that I just want to talk about a little bit before we sort of go into this a bit further. So the first is domestic partner-based violence. So that's physical, it could be sexual, it could also be psychological, so fear, coercion, control, isolation, but it could also be economic, so having control over finances, stopping access to work, for example. Sexual violence, so rape, but also sexual harassment, sexual violence used in conflict, and that could be sexual slavery or sterilization. Femicide, which is killing of women and girls because of their gender, based on discrimination, stereotypes, inequalities in power. And that could be private or public. So it could happen in the domestic sphere, but it could also take the form of human trafficking, and that women and girls are the primary group targeted here. Also through forced labour, honour killings, infanticide. And then other groups of violence against women we could think about are things like FGM, child and forced marriage, purity tests, forced body modification, so foot binding would be an example there, and also online violence. So as Anne brought up, and that could be being in those toxic toxic places online, but it could also be online stalking. It could be the use of deep fake images to make women look like they're doing things that aren't them. Could be through revenge porn as well. And when we're thinking about sort of how common this is, the UN's collected data, and it's not a sort of complete picture, but it's got data from at least 161 countries. And they state that almost 1 in 3 women have faced at some point physical or sexual partner violence at least once. And most violence towards women is committed by partners or ex-partners. 140 women or girls are killed every day by a member of their family or their extended family, and that counts for 60% of female homicides. And adolescents are more at risk. And they estimate that by 19, 24% of women have faced physical, sexual, or psychological partner violence. Women with disabilities are at a heightened risk of facing violence. And also women are, we know, are more affected by global crises. So as I was saying, climate change, 80% of those people who are displaced by climate change are women. And crises also increase gender-based violence. So after the Canterbury earthquake in New Zealand, domestic violence rose 53%. We also see in areas of conflict that child marriage rises by about 4% as well. And there are also limited protections for women. So in 2022, only 14% of women and girls lived in countries with a strong legal protection of women's rights. And 60% of countries lack rape laws that are based on consent. As we've seen in the text that we've been reading as well, we also know that modern warfare targets civilians, so that impacts women as well as other groups, but also we see sexual violence is used as a tactic and as a consequence of conflict. So when we're thinking about the causes of gender-based violence, there isn't a single cause, but research from Oxfam shows that some of the strongest and most consistent factors are harmful social norms that contribute to gender inequality. So that's ideas that are based on how people should behave, the idea of domination and control, ideas, sort of strict ideas about gender roles. They list 10 particular norms that they think are really impactful. So first is that women should be submissive to male family members. Men are expected to exercise coercive control. Men have a right to discipline women for incorrect behaviour. Women cannot deny their male partner's sex. Sexual harassment is seen as normal. Women experience violence because they're dressed provocatively. All women should become mothers. Girls are valued as wives, not as individuals. Divorced women have less value, and heterosexuality being seen as the only sexual orientation that is acceptable. And again, we know that women and girls with disabilities, but also divorced women, lesbian women, trans women, widows, and sex workers are much more likely to face violence. So we can see that even during times of so-called peace, women are still disproportionately impacted by violence. And the Advancing Nonviolence text argues that religion and culture play roles in this by shaping and legitimating a culture of violence against women. And these systems may be marshalled to stigmatise female survivors of violence, shunning them from their communities of faith. And that can contribute to perceptions of women's inferiority and gender norms that prescribe the limits of their authority. So that leads to structural forms of injustice and marginalisation within institutions and communities as well. And the text argues that religion has been misused to justify and legitimise gender-based violence. So that could be, for example, by implying a hierarchy where men are seen as superior or dominant, and women are seen as inferior, subordinate, impure, sinful, or their worth is based on maternity. And it gives a couple of examples here. So one of these would be the church counselling women to stay in abusive marriages, to forgive their abusers, use of scripture to show that women are perhaps more inherently sinful, they have less dignity, but also the exclusion of women from leadership roles. And it also links here clerical abuse as a symptom of this, so driven by these ideas around clericalism, power, hierarchy, and gender. We also see instances of gender-based violence within scripture, and there are also passages that seem to justify or sanctify this. So it's also key thing to think about here, as well as examining those properly. And the text argues that we should read these as challenges to narratives that aim to sanctify and justify gender-based violence today. I'm going to talk a little bit about theology here as well. So we can see within the church's teachings, there are very strict principles that show how gender-based violence is really incompatible with Christianity. And we see that in the core principles of Catholic social teaching. So the idea of human dignity that's inherent to everyone, everyone's made in the image of God, regardless of their gender, regardless of sexual orientation, etc. But also the principle of participation. So everyone is called to have a full active role to participate in society. I would argue though, and I'm saying this is very much my perspective, that I think sometimes the social teachings can come into contention with teachings on gender and sexual ethics. So we see that very much the church's teaching about gender is very rooted in this idea of complementarity of the sexes. It's a very binary approach of two genders that have distinct spheres, distinct, what's the word I'm looking for? Charisms. And also those kind of perhaps narrow visions of an ideal nuclear family. And that has implications for institutional structures, so in the church, the parish, but it also sets up a bit of a divide between those public and private spheres that I don't think is necessarily helpful. And the reason I say that is because I think the personal relates to the political. So someone's experience as a woman, that relates to how they're being treated socially, but also vice versa. I think that they both influence each other. And we also see within the text that they argue that gender-based violence has also received a lack of proper attention by theologians. And I think although there are steps towards this, it hasn't always been called out in church teaching how women are most affected by things like poverty and conflict. And I think it's probably also worth thinking a little bit about historically who has made and done theology and that task of theology too. So I just want us to pause here and I'll put this into our breakout rooms. And what I just want us to think about, what do we think are the causes of gender-based violence? What role do we think religion plays? Do we think it makes sense to think of theology as violent or theology as doing violence? And do we see that within the church? I'll put those questions in the chat. And then I think if we have maybe 10 to 15 minutes in our breakout rooms, then I'll bring us together again.
that last bit.
Thanks so much, everyone, for discussion. I think if we just go around and if people want to share anything from their groups, maybe if we start with group 1, so that was my group. If anyone wants to share anything.
Yeah, well, all right. Well, one thing I would want to share is the desirability of a much stronger and slightly different picture of Mary, the mother of Jesus, and see her more as sister in the struggle, rather than a plaster saint on a pedestal. And that would be an alternative to the Old Testament sort of pictures of good women who in general were militaristic and rather violent. The other thing is the extent to which the church could be much clearer that sexual violence, rape, and the rest of it in warfare, whether open or civil, is explicitly something that's not acceptable.
Thanks, David. Thank you. So, anything else anyone would like to share from group 1? Oh, Anne, can't hear you.
We talked a lot. We talked a lot about how the noticing the problems of women, really, and how we're learning more about young people growing up with gender stereotypes, and I just thought that Peter's point about what are we doing to address these challenges, how do we raise consciousness, and that he suggested education is really important to challenge stereotypes and challenge violence and any kind of gender violence, gender stereotyping. So
yeah, thanks, Anne. Anything else anyone wanted to share? No. How about group 2? Is it anyone want to give us a bit of a summary or share anything you're discussing? Oh, Elizabeth, sorry.
Sorry, I was just saying that we were, well, I was talking a bit about the role models being offered to boys based on competitiveness and excelling and controlling behavior. That's all they're being offered, is what I was thinking.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Is there anyone in group 2 who'd like to feedback? Or anyone who just wants to share any thoughts they had?
Well, we talked about quite a few different things, but one thing that struck me, and I think we all kind of tuned in on, was this. I think it was Owen that talked about this idea of respect for men, and how that was the sort of basis for us to kind of not get into controlling situations, whether it be one way or the other. And we talked a little bit about different cultural and either through time or through geography, that there were differences, and but although there were differences, there were also similarities. But I think also we touched on that role of men and fathers. I think that in certain societies, fatherhood isn't really seen as being something important, and how does that affect how men behave? So that was a few of the things that we talked about. I'm sure if somebody else wants to add anything else, but maybe just as in addition, Owen told us a bit about his priest sermon from last Sunday for vacations, and I think it was rather an interesting sermon. But if he wants to share that, he can. I'll leave it to him.
Thanks, Rosalind. Thank you.
Fascism all.
Oh, Owen, I can't hear you. Oh, there you go.
Can you hear now?
Yeah. Mhm.
As the kit was spoke about, young men worried about their position in society today, and Miriam spoke also in relation to a school in Zambia where that she got the impression that the teachers were more encouraging of the girls to educate themselves, find themselves that education, take it seriously, to the extent that the boys are wondering, who is it that that's important here, maybe. It would kind of, fit in with that idea, not just of their position, but of their, respect for them in relation to girls and so on. That was another aspect of it.
Yeah, thanks, Owen. So that I suppose also, I suppose what we were talking about a bit at the beginning, that kind of marginalisation or people feeling they don't have a place in society, and yeah. So anything else anyone wanted to share from group 2? Okay, so I think we'll move on then and just talk a little bit about the role of the church and maybe some ideas of thinking what can we do to move forward. So within the text, we see the church as they speak about the church as a countersign to violence and sin in the world. But part of this is that the church needs to recognise its own role and its own complicity in violence. And I think it points to certain steps towards this in the context that we're talking about. So the 2016 apology that Pope Francis gave to gay persons, exploited women and children. Also apologies from Pope John Paul II and Benedict and Francis for clerical sex abuse. But the text argues that these apologies are really just the first step and that more is needed here. So it talks about the need for a transformation of structures, cultures, restorative justice. And I think we can see some steps forward here. So we can see Pope Francis as explicitly calling out violence against women several times, also appointing women to leadership positions, and also within the synod process, so that idea of listening to different voices, listening to those who have been marginalised by the church, women being involved in decision-making processes and more leadership. But I think really we're sort of seeing the beginnings here of a much longer process in the church. So when we're thinking about where do we look to, I think the text gives us some really good examples and lessons from the gospel. So we see within Jesus' ministry the acknowledgement of women and having a very close relationship with women, those who are marginalised, also victims of violence. The text talks about Jesus' ministry as to, with, and led by women. So we see Jesus as challenging the norms of the time, and one example here is John 4, so when Jesus is talking with the Samaritan woman at the well. And the disciples are really surprised to see Jesus talking to her. But in this extract, we see Jesus revealing salvation to the women. So he says, whoever drinks the water I gave them will never thirst, but also revealing himself as the Messiah. And it's the Samaritan woman here who brings others back to Jesus and shares this message. And really, we see the subversion of norms of authority here. And the text tells us that many of the Samaritans from that town believed in him because of the woman's testimony, which at the time would have been very unusual. We also see Jesus refusing to abide by the purity laws. So he brings healing to women, but also brings healing to the bleeding woman who's outcast, healing the crippled women. We also see Jesus using the marginalized and women as moral exemplars in his parables. So we could think about the widow's mite as one example here. And also see women playing a prominent role in discipleship. So it's women who are the first to recognize Jesus as the Messiah, women who are present at the crucifixion, and also the first to see Jesus after the resurrection and share this teaching. And also women as central to spreading teaching. So you see that in the Acts of the Apostles. But as the text tells us, there's often this failure to acknowledge or appreciate women's role. And especially we see that within non-violence as well, and maybe more patriarchal writings of history. But within gospel non-violence, we do see women as playing a central role. And I won't sort of go through everything that we've read, but some of the things that are pointed out to us are how we've seen, even within early Christian resistance, women refusing to abide by gender norms at the time because of their faith. So the Acts of Thecla. We could also think about some of the martyrs as well, like Saint Cecilia, who's taken a vow of virginity but is put into a forced marriage, and resists the norms there, and tries to work within her sphere of domestic influence to convert her husband and his brother. Although we might want to think a little bit about how some of those martyrs have been used in more of a purity culture way, but we can maybe take that as a more subversive message as well. And we also see a huge role of for women in the peace movement. So in that fight for gender equality, the end to gender-based violence, so the women's right to vote, for example. And we've seen within the text, women are already in these marginalized spaces, they're away from spheres of power. So they're tending towards avenues of non-violent resistance as a way to enact change because they're deprived from other spheres of influence. And we also see that as the perceptions of women as less powerful or less influential are used to their advantage to go under the radar. So using invisibility, that non-threatening status, to their advantage to work in subversive ways. And it's a really good podcast, and the name of that I can't remember right now. But it's all about women in resistance movements. There's a really nice example of women in, I think it's in the Peasants' Revolt, and because they have no legal rights, they're not treated as people. They do lots of things that men would have been arrested for. So they really start to use this in a very subversive way. Talking more broadly about non-violence here, the text argues that for non-violent movements to succeed, they need to be aware of gender inequalities and work to be inclusive. And it says that they must take into account forms of violence that affect women and girls, seeing these as just as critical to address. These are just as critical to address as the political forms of violence more often acknowledged, especially in wartime. And so some of the ways it suggests that this can be done is through more support, more acknowledgement of the leadership of women. And it argues that if these movements aren't inclusive, they perpetuate forms of structural and cultural violence. And again, the text argues this is a moral duty, following the example of Jesus, and that the church needs to listen to these voices in the pursuit of non-violence. So I just want us to pause again here, and we'll just go into our breakout rooms very quickly so we can leave a little bit of time for discussion at the end. And just think through some of the questions of how do we think the church should respond to gendered violence? How should it respond to violence done by the church? And what do we see as the role of women in gospel non-violence? And what do we think we could learn from this? So the questions are in the chat, and I will open the breakout rooms. And I'm trying to find that painting you were talking about on Google, and I can't find it any. It's just stupid AI images of replaced the Last Supper with different people. I think we're all back. So maybe if we'll do a quick little roundup of what we discussed in our rooms. Room 2, do you want to start us off?
I think what Owen was saying about the Irish church and the difference between the Irish church and the Roman church was really quite thought-provoking, how women had a much bigger role. Yeah, Owen is probably person to explain that more.
Thanks, Kit.
There's been a recent article about the Synod of Whitby, and it was answered, a response to it, by a lady called, I don't know if you know her, Anna, the Dr. Anne Inman, who seems to be a theologian, I think, from a Dr. Anne, and she was writing about the Synod of Whitby, and saying that, you know, sort of at that meeting, well, I can't remember it all. I wrote it down simply because it said that in the 7th century, men and women in the Irish tradition had worked alongside each other in the mission of the church, sharing both sacramental and leadership offices. And in Rome, meanwhile, at the same time, there was a concerted effort to elevate ordained men onto an altogether higher plane than the rest of the faithful. And the abandonment of Irish customs led to the relegation of women's roles to a subordinate status in the mission of the church, a situation which continues to this day. So that was in the last issue of the tablet. So obviously it is something which is still being argued about 14 centuries later or 15 centuries later about this, you know, this problem. And I'd like to know what other things, you know, what was the ministerial tasks that were done by women in the Irish church, as well as, you know, sort of other pastoral things.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Owen. That's really interesting. So anything else from group 2 that people wanted to share?
Marion talked about humility, I think, in the sense of the absence of it in the Trump office, when he and his vice president confronted President Zelensky, and that really synodality and listening rather than shouting at somebody is to be promoted in the church and in every part of it.
Yeah, thanks, Owen. Anyone from group 1 who wants to share anything?
I think we talked about retelling the stories from the perspective of women, and we realized how conditioned our understanding of the gospel is by our cultural context. It hasn't always been quite the same as it is now.
Yeah, I think you brought up some quite interesting points, Elizabeth, about different understandings of Genesis at different times in history, and
yeah, and the roles of men and women in society versus the roles of the clerical order and the laity and that stuff.
Yeah. Is there anything else anyone wanted to share? I think we are already over time, so I'll round up the discussion. People need to go then, please feel free, because I know we have run over, but if you have any thoughts just for a bit of reflection, and if you want to email these later, you can, if you need to leave. But I just thought it'd be useful to know a little bit about, having done the book project, what have we learned? Have our thoughts on non-violence changed in any way? But also, probably more importantly, what questions might we still have? And is there anything else that you think would be useful to look at if we're thinking about sort of ideas moving forward of what we might do next? David?
Yeah, I found this document unsatisfactory in a number of areas. And one particular one is the absence of a reasonably rigorous approach on moral theology. And what I would very much like to do is, for example, to look in more detail at Richard Hayes' book on moral version in the New Testament, which has a chapter on violence in defense of justice, which I think is a much more challenging and deeply reflective approach to looking at what Jesus taught, what Scripture says, and why has the church changed its views.
So a bit more getting into the theological nitty-gritty.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks, David.
Well, personally, I found it really interesting because I looked at areas I'd never even thought of looking at the Old Testament, for example, in such a deep way. So I found it very useful. I in fact found the whole thing quite thought-provoking, very thought-provoking. And my only real concern was some of the words in this book. I had to have a dictionary by me all the time. And I forgave it, but I thought something must have been translated by somebody who's never come across English before. But that was only
when you see how many authors it had, it's a wonder it was managed together.
That's right.
I'd just like to say that I found this hugely helpful, and I found the discussions great, and I'd just like to thank everybody for it. I know I came in as kind of an outsider, but I was delighted to do that, and I found it really helped me. I suppose I'm still looking, I mean, in terms of the move from all of this to the sort of practical expression of it, or finding a few people to move on with in this particular way, because I was quite taken with that, just the earlier bit about being on the protest march and then being uncomfortable. And I've had that kind of feeling here, not been on the march, but like, I don't know, it's very hard to get it right without completely isolating yourself and being in a group of one or two.
Yeah, thanks, Gareth. That's really useful. Thank you.
Could I just say a big thank you to everybody for the way that they have thrown themselves into the discussion and into the groups and so on. I think that has been really quite inspirational for most of us. I think that we've found that very helpful. And before Anna finishes up, I should say a huge thank you to Anna.
Yes.
No, thank
Here,
you.
here. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much. Well, I just
Absolutely
like to
brilliant. Thank you.
you. But also just like to echo what you said, Marianne, because I feel like I've got a lot out of it as well, because having the discussions has been, yeah, really enriching and help. I think also because I've seen the text so many times, so I just talked about these issues so many times. It's really nice to think in new ways. So the discussions have been really wonderful. And I think Marianne was like, when we've spoken about how the project's been going, we've said everyone has really just been so honest and open. And I think that's really wonderful, especially on an online group. It's been I found it a really amazing little sort of community of people really sharing really honestly. So thank you all very, very much. Thank you.
You've taken me to places that I've never been to before, Anna.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Is there any things sort of looking forward? I know we've sort of said about the practical expressions and moral theology. Is there anything else that anyone would think would be useful to do?
I think what would be a good idea would be to let everybody have a think.
Do we have a think
that.
about it? Yeah.
And then you can email myself and Anna, and I'll pass everything on to Anna, and we'll see where we can go from there. Because I think that
Great.
I think there is a feeling that we would like to take it. We'd like to take this idea forward. Yeah.
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 Yeah. Yeah. Well, please do email ideas. That would be really excellent. And just thank you so much, everyone, again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So will we say a really big thank you to everybody, and have a lovely summer, whatever happens in the world, because it's not very nice out there. But try and look after yourselves, and perhaps as it gets to the autumn, we'll all be back together again, and we'll take something forward. So thank you, and I thank the Holy Spirit for being with us, because I think she has, and she knows what she's doing.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you, Marianne.
Thank you, and good night, everybody.
Good night.
Right.
Bye.
Bye.